Okay, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the December 14th meeting of the Joint Committee on Pensions. I am the Senate Chair, Sarah Elfrith, joined by my co-chair in the House, Delegate Brooke Learman. We are at our annual decisions meeting. Last week at our last meeting, we heard a number of pieces of board recommended legislation. First on the agenda is for this joint committee to make decisions on those recommendations. And then after that, we will have our annual state retirement pension system investment overview, which we all look forward to every year. And after that, after questions from committee members, we will adjourn and everybody can get to their fun holiday festivities I know we all have throughout our districts. So with that, I believe I am turning this over to June and Philip and Anne.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to just jump right in, and I'm just going to go start a quick review of what the agency presented last week. So the first legislative proposal is technical, and it codifies the agency's existing practice on administering the return of contributions of a deceased non-vested former member, which basically means a former state employee who was not vested in the system and has died. The agency's current practice disperses the accumulated contributions of the deceased member to the designated beneficiary, or if no beneficiary has been named, to the deceased member's estate. However, there is no express law that authorizes this action, so this proposed legislation codifies the agency's practice. Any questions? That's the summary of the first piece.
Thank you, June. And I was remiss, everybody should have received the decisions document in an email with the agenda. If you've not received the decisions document, please let us know in the chat and we'll get it to you. There were no questions on this last week. June and Phil, do we want to take these one at a time or probably one at a time? Okay. Wonderful. Okay. And I believe it's a motion to adopt the prompt. Philip, you're on mute.
Move to adopt the recommendation.
Yeah, all the motions would be to sponsor.
Okay.
Or not the requested legislation.
It's a little odd since we're a joint committee. Okay, is there a motion to sponsor or adopt the recommendation?
So moved.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. Wonderful. We have our first piece of legislation for 2023. It's very exciting.
Okay. All right, moving on to the second proposed legislation. So the second one is a two-part legislative proposal that basically deals with the employees that were transferred into the correctional officer system. I think in Anne's presentation last week, she reminded you that this process has been ongoing for several years now. So I believe it started in 2016, and we passed legislation last year also that continued that process. So this first part is technical and basically corrects last year's legislation, which was Chapter 147. And that moves certain Department of Juvenile Service employees from the employee system into the correctional officer system. So past legislation that had done similar transfers basically included provisions that preserved unused sick leave that was earned in the employee system prior to the employees being transferred and moved into the correctional officer system. However, Chapter 147 omitted the similar provisions that would have done this for those employees as well. So this first part of the next legislation basically allows these transferred employees under Chapter 147 to retain their unused sick leave that was earned in the employee system, and basically allows it to apply in the correctional officer system. So any questions? And back to you, Madam Chair.
Seeing no questions, is there a motion to adopt?
Move to adopt.
Move. Second.
Second. Aye.
All those in favor? Thank you, Senator Griffin. Getting giddy with holiday cheer. Okay, any opposed? Wonderful. Thank you, June. Delegate Learman, would you like to take over?
Sure. Thank you so much. It is moved and seconded and adopted. So the joint committee has its second piece of legislation. June, let's keep going. Next piece.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the second part of the requested legislation that deals with the correctional officer system is basically the agency has requested that we would, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. The agency has requested legislation that basically would require the agency to retroactively transfer the service credit of various employees who have not elected the option to transfer their earned service in the employee system into the correctional officer system. So the bills that were passed in 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2022 moved these employees from the employee system to the correctional officer system. And in that legislation, or in those bills, they were also provided the option about whether or not to transfer their service that they earned under the employee system into the correctional officer system. So last week, the agency presented on their outreach and review of the impact of this on the employees who chose to transfer and those who did not choose to transfer. And what they found was that the transferring of earned service into the correctional officer system was more beneficial for the employee. So this legislation would require that all members would have to transfer unless that member notifies the agency not to perform the transfer of that earned service in the employee system into the correctional officer system.
So this is the bill. So this is the bill where it was originally, we sort of made it an opt-in many years ago, and then realized what we should have done was make it an opt-out. And so this bill will correct that, which is to the benefit of the employee. Is that correct? Yeah, I see nods. That's good. Any questions on this legislation? Do we have a motion to sponsor the legislation?
Move to adopt.
Second.
Great. All those in favor of sponsoring this legislation, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. Motion carries, and the joint committee will sponsor the bill. Next.
Okay, then moving on to the next and final legislation that I'll go over with you is that the agency presented last week on the complicated process for calculating administrative fees that are assessed on the state and participating employers. In part, it results from the calculation that is actually based upon the governor's allowance in the budget bill before it has even passed the legislature. So as a result of that, there are constant surpluses and deficiencies that are tracked by both the agency and DBM, and then they are assessed obviously on the participating employers. So it would end up being either a recovery or a reimbursement. The board recommends legislation that requires the rate for these administrative expenses be based on the actual amount that the state retirement agency spent during the second previous fiscal year. So any questions on that? And back to you, Madam Chair.
Here, Elfreth, you want to take it?
Sure. Any questions? Seeing none, is there a motion to adopt?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor of adopting the recommendation?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, we're on a roll.
All right. The final piece of legislation for your consideration is related to the systems amortization policy. By way of background, back in 2013, there was a change in the policy that established the current model, which is a closed 25-year period. It started in 2013. And so the issue that we're coming up on is that as we move through that 25-year period, that leaves less and less time remaining to amortize any gains, losses over that remaining 25-year period. And why that's significant is that with fewer years, that will start creating potentially significant volatility in the employer contribution rate. And so those budgeted amounts have the potential to fluctuate wildly under the current amortization period as we move through that 25-year period. Last week you heard presentations. So back in 2021, the board had conducted a series of reviews and made a recommendation to move towards a new amortization policy that they were basically, the discussion centered around two options. The option that there was discussion about last week, there's really one feature, and that was how to amortize the gains and losses. The board's proposed model had a 15-year rolling pooled amortization period. And so every year that would just keep moving along as we move through time. Whereas the model policy is a layered 15-year approach. So each year would have a set closed 15-year amortization period for the gains losses. And then the next year you'd have a new 15-year period. And so over time, 16 years later, that first year would roll off and you keep moving through. The advantage of that is that it gives some transparency as to the source of those various liabilities. And the rationale for the board's proposal was to mitigate volatility in those contribution rates, which is kind of the point of this whole exercise. However, with the closed amortization layered 15-year model, that's the model practice according to the actuarial best practices, you will have better progress towards meeting your full funding goals. And also a best practice, which we've included as an option here, would be to authorize the board to manage those layers for the purpose of mitigating contribution rate volatility, which is the whole point of needing to make this change here. So for your consideration, first option would be to accept the board's proposal. We have, I should say, we've had some discussion since last week, and regarding modifying that board's proposal to use the 15-year closed layered model for the gains and losses. There's no discomfort with that among both the system and our legislative actuaries. And so being that that's the model approach, as long as you have the authorization for the active management of those various liability bases, comfortable that that is a best practice for changing the amortization policy.
Thank you, Philip. I believe we're gonna have a number of questions about this, starting with Senator Rosepap.
Thank you. Philip, you mentioned something that moving towards the new system would get us farther away from meeting our funding goal. Did I understand you correctly?
The concern around the pooled rolling that the board had adopted is that kind of can push achieving that full funding status, whereas the model policy with the closed 15-year layered amortization can achieve that better than what the board had proposed, the pooled rolling.
Well, okay, then I did understand it. So my question is, how significant is that, or do we have any idea?
I don't have any hard, we do have the actuaries here.
Maybe they can address
any questions that maybe they want to speak to that.
Well, if we're comparing the one that the board supported with the one that's before the group now, the one that the board supported, the two are identical except for one thing, which is that each year there are gains and losses, mostly on the investments. And the hope would be that they tend to offset each other. A gain one year is a loss next year. And so the total of the gains and losses over time should be small. So the board supported a policy that says just keep track of all those gains and losses, add them up, and always amortize them over a constant 15-year period so that to avoid a lot of volatility. The policy that's being proposed is quite similar, except it says track each gain and loss base separately, and then if you see volatility, combine them. So at the end of the day, the difference probably is not great, is not very large, but the requirement for active management means that you kind of have to watch it all the time, which is okay.
I understand that on the mechanics. I'm really asking, switching from what we currently do to this rolling approach.
Oh,
Philip suggested that puts us farther away from our full funding goal. I'm trying to understand.
No, the difference between the 15 for any change, not compared to our current, the current model is going to be potentially untenable in this next remaining period because of the volatility swings with having less years to amortize every gain and loss.
No, I got that. I mean, we talked about that last time. I'm just trying to understand how significant an impact is. It like 1/10 of 1% impact in reaching our stated goal, or is it like a 10% impact in terms of reaching our goal? That's what I'm trying to get. Is it material?
It is material with the current policy. It could be possible that you can't reach the goal, because what could happen is that when you're down to the last year or two, there could be a significant loss, and we would come to the legislature and say, there was a $20 billion loss last year. We need that money now to meet the goal.
Right.
And that would not be practical. So with the current policy, those losses, if they occur, are spread out into the future so that you don't have that sudden change all at once. And that's really the reason for the change.
Right.
Difference between the two alternatives we're discussing now is, incremental. But the difference between the current policy and this one is significant.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairs.
And we also have the legislature actuary Bolton here. I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to comment.
I certainly can. I think the only other comment I wanted to throw in there was that, that when you look at the two different alternatives for amortizing the future gains and losses, using the open approach puts you in a position that after 15 years, it's a 15-year amortization base, you keep restarting every year. After 15 years, you still have 25% of the unfunded liability that you started off amortizing left to go. Versus on the closed layered, that entire amortization base would be paid off after the 15 years. So it's a little bit of a theoretical issue, but that's why when Philip mentioned why the CCA has this as their model practice, that's the reason that the bases do get fully funded in a discrete period of time.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to our great counsel. Any other questions? Want to make sure this is fully understood.
That's overstating it. Doesn't have to be fully understood. It has to be generally and mostly understood. Materially
understood.
Sorry.
Keeping in mind that we're going to have another bite at this apple when we get into session, but we want to make sure that we are all comfortable with this concept moving forward.
Right. And so I think what we've been discussing, I think, would be to do, I think in your decision document would be under option B, which would be to modify the board's proposal to conform it to the best actuarial practice for the model approach using that 15-year layered, also authorizing the board, giving them authority to manage the various bases for the purpose of controlling that volatility.
I'll move favorable if that's what.
Yes, that is a mouthful of a motion, but the motion is to adopt the modified recommendation,
Yes.
option B in your packet. I believe
Yes.
Senator Roosevelt has moved the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Senator Eckert. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we have a lot of homework
Yeah.
for session. Thank
Good luck.
you. Thank you as always. Thank you, Senator Eckert. As always, to Philip and June and Anne, thank you for taking difficult concepts and explaining them effectively. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and that's all the legislation before you. Next, if you're okay, we can move to the investment overview.
Yes, let's go for that. So we have Philip, we have Martin Noven, who's our executive director of the system, and Andy Palmer, our chief investment officer, all old friends to the joint committee.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Philip Anthony, Department of Legislative Services, presenting the fiscal 2022 State Retirement and Pension System Investment Overview. First, I'd like to start off thanking the retirement system CIO Palmer, Deputy CIO Robert Bird, Executive Director Martin Noven, and Gothrop, the Director of Legislative Affairs. Can't really do this without their assistance, so thanks to them as always. If we move to page 3, I guess I can share my screen here. Starting with Exhibit 1. Shows the system's amortization, or I'm sorry, the system's asset allocation policy, both the actual and the targets. This is a process where over the past few years, it's been fairly stable. Every year, the system, at least annually, is reviewing the allocation of the system's assets for investments. The significance of that is that the investment allocation is largely going to drive the types of returns that the system is seeing. System has over the years increased investment in private equity, which has resulted in substantial positive returns for the system with less experienced volatility than public equity. What we have seen over the years is that lower allocations, like what we have in our system to public equity, and in particular U.S. public equity, can result in comparatively different returns when you're looking at our peer systems based on how much you have in each of those, and when those assets are doing well, the comparative returns are going to be less. But the board, back after the Great Recession, made a conscious effort to place the system in a position where it's able to achieve the necessary returns to fund the system benefits, but also to mitigate the risk of investment losses where possible. And we've seen that borne out in this past year. So for moving on to Exhibit 2 on page 5. So for fiscal 2022, the system had a return. It was a loss of just under 3%, compared to the assumed rate of return of 6.8%. However, I would note many other systems had substantially higher losses than was experienced by the system. And so going back to that asset allocation and risk consciousness that the board has undertaken, avoiding losses is always, that could be more severe, is always a positive. I know it's strange to say when we have a 3% loss, but when you look at some other systems, we actually, that's actually not a bad thing. The system assets decreased slightly to 64.6 billion compared to 67.9 at the end of fiscal 2021. And system did, despite the returns, the system did also outperform its benchmark on the whole by about 0.5%, 51 basis points. You see on here on Exhibit 3. So this leads to our first request for comment. We've asked the system to comment on the fiscal 2022 return performance in relation to the policy benchmarks, and for any asset classes that underperformed, comment on the factors that led to that underperformance, whether the factors are expected to continue to affect performance in 2023, and what actions are being taken to mitigate those impacts. Moving on to our next item on Exhibit 4. This is performance relative to other systems. So one way to look at our investments from a kind of a 30,000-foot view is to do a comparison of how we did compared to other peer systems. And so we have the TUX rankings. As you'll see in 2022, again, going back to that asset allocation concept, we finished in the 37th percentile. So in the TUX rankings, 1 is the best, all the way down to the bottom, 100 is the worst. So we have, as you'll see, traditionally, longer term, we tend to have underperformed in prior years when you had those high domestic U.S. equity returns that we were underweight on comparatively. But again, you see in this down market, we have that protective shield of the allocation positioning us better than our peer systems. Moving on to Exhibit 5, another aspect of looking at the comparatives is to look at how we did within an asset class. So when you are looking at the total TUX rankings, there's going to be a significant impact on the asset allocation. So like I said, if there's one asset that did a lot better in one particular year and one system has a lot more of that or did really well on that, their comparative ranking is gonna look better than other systems. However, when you look at assets on their individual basis, it's more of an apples to apples comparison for evaluating how the system is actually doing in its management of the investments. And you'll see here on these TUX rankings, we have significantly better performance in a number of time periods, a number of assets for how we perform relative to peers. And then in particular, I would note the private equity portfolio over a 10-year period is ranked in that first top percentile. So again, in thinking about the system's performance comparatively, you want to keep in mind the allocation strategy as well as how you're performing in each individual asset class. We have asked on page 9, I'm sorry, we actually asked, you're on page 8, the system to comment on the relative TUX rankings and how the asset allocation has impacted that. And then on page 9, we've further asked the system to comment on how the asset allocation strategy has mitigated the investment losses for fiscal 2022, and what the impact of those that loss mitigation is. Moving on to our next topic, Exhibit 6 on page 10, discussion of asset management fees. In 2022, the system incurred about $569 million in investment management fees, which was an increase from $544 million in 2021. As a percent of assets under management, management fees were slightly less than 2021 by about 3 basis points. I would note that review of the systems by the system's investment consultant has regularly noted that the system has been effective at negotiating favorable fee arrangements. And then also the system has been transitioning some assets to internal management, which is not going to have the same associated fee structure as an externally managed asset. The next issue related to fees, if you look at Exhibit 7, this is a comparison of system assets that are actively managed versus passively managed. In the short term, you see a little bit of underperformance, but largely on a longer period, we've either tracked closely or outperformed with our active management, which is adding value to the system. One thing I did want to note, I've noted this the past few years, is kind of comparing and contrasting absolute return and private equity. These are both two assets that have your traditional management fee with other additional incentive, carried interest type manager fees related. Contrasting the two, absolute return was $131.3 million in fees, which was about 23% of all management fees, while comprising about 7.6% of the investments. However, over the years, absolute return has had issues with underperformance relative to its benchmarks, and there is, I think the system is going to note that there are some issues on absolute return in terms of finding a benchmark that closely tracks what we're doing, but nevertheless, there has been underperformance both with respect to benchmarks that were in place as well as the stated goals for the absolute return portfolio. And so we've asked the system to comment on that asset class's underperformance relative to its benchmarks in light of its high management fee structures. Moving to private equity fees, however, so similarly, private equity was about 23.7% of management fees, while constituting 21.5% of system assets. However, the private equity return was 24.53%, which was also about 0.5% over its benchmark. And then over the 1, 3, 5, and 10-year periods, private equity returns were 24.53%, 24.67%, 21.38%, and 17.69% respectively. And those are all net of the management fees. So you see in this asset class, as we noted earlier with the TUX rankings, this has been an asset class that's been very significant in the health of the investment portfolio and the trust. Another aspect of private equity fees that I would note is that the system has been utilizing what's called co-investing. So when we are already working with an investment where there's capacity for additional investments that the general partner may not have the ability to meet, they do reach out to their limited partners. And in those instances, we have the opportunity to add more to an investment that we're already invested in, but those co-investments don't carry the same types of fee loads. So it's effectively reducing the amount of fees that were being attributed to that investment. The only downside is, it's a slight decrease in diversification, but generally it's something that systems already, earmarked to be invested in, and the relationship we have, it's a prudent approach to, with especially considering the returns that we've been seeing with the managers that we've been working with. We have asked the system to provide an update on the estimated carried interest for calendar 2022, as that's not going to be included in the fee exhibit. The next issue is investment division staffing. So back in 2018, those of you that were here, we had legislation proposed and ultimately passed by the legislature to give the system authority to create positions and establish the compensation for investment division functions, including utilizing incentive compensation. The main purpose of that was twofold. One, the system wanted to be able to retain the existing employees it had, and then also be able to recruit additional employees in the context of the fund gaining more assets, and additionally with the plan to move towards more internal management of assets by system staff. Since the passage of that legislation, the system has been able to hire additional staff. However, last year there was an issue that was brought before you all, and there was legislation passed, Chapter 356. The initial authorization had controls over year increases, and so what happened? The idea being that if the study for what the appropriate compensation was going to be like 100% increase, it didn't want people rocketing up that fast. But what ended up happening is new employees were being compensated at higher rates than legacy employees. And so last year, you all had passed legislation to authorize the board to do some catch up to bring employees to the midpoint who weren't there. So we've asked the system to comment on the use of that authority in the past year and in the future. As I said, the board was authorized to grant incentive compensation. So we've asked the system to update you on the use of that authority and its effect on recruitment and retention. Moving on to page 15, we have some information on the internal management performance. So there's about, I think it's a little bit over 9 billion that is currently being managed internally. And again, as I stated, that part of the benefit of this is that we're not going to be experiencing the same external management fee loads on these investments. So it should be adding value to the portfolio. And what we've seen is that the system internal management assets have been tracking fairly closely with their benchmarks, and in some instances outperforming them. So this is a regular comment we've asked just to for the system to give us an estimate on the fee savings that are attributable to internally managed assets, and then additionally to update you on their processes and expectations for building out additional internal management of assets. Moving to page 16, investment climate risk. So last year legislation was passed, chapters 24 and 25. It was sponsored by this joint committee to codify the consideration of climate risk for on the system's assets. And so the legislation does not require systems to take any specific action for any particular asset. Instead, it's focused on ensuring that the system fiduciaries are well informed of the potential impacts of climate risk to the system assets, just as they have duties to stay informed of any other financial system or any other financial risks to system assets. Legislation was intended to ensure that the system is aware of developing information regarding climate risk, so that it's able to respond prudently and efficiently when related climate risk or opportunity for investment arises. In many ways, the legislation codifies many of the activities that the system has already established as regular practice. And so as chapters 24 and 25 included requirements that would either continue current practices or require the build out of new activities for the investment division, there's an expectation that additional positions and consultants may be needed. Fortunately, as noted previously, that 2018 legislation did grant the board authority to establish positions within the investment division, as well as set the compensation. And I think just this past fall, the system had created a new position related to senior governance related to environmental, social, and governance investment matters. So we've just asked the system to provide an update on where they're at with implementing chapters 24 and 25. The final couple items, the system's Terra Maria program. This is the system's emerging manager program. Exhibit 9 on page 18 shows the program assets and management. The total assets decreased slightly to 2.2 billion. And as a proportion of total assets, it also decreased to 3.4% of total assets. I would note that since inception, the program managers have generally had returns above the system's assumed rate of return, with 3 of the 4 outperforming the benchmarks. And then I would also note, you won't see it here, but the Terra Maria program is active management, and in U.S. nominal fixed income, the Terra Maria, although it had a loss of 9.2%, that was significantly better than comparative returns of about 13.5% for actively managed non-Terra Maria investments, and 17% loss for passively managed investments in that asset class. The final item is the systems currency program. This was adopted in fiscal 2009. The concept is that pretty much all of our benefits need to be paid out in US dollars, but we have a global portfolio. And so as the strength of the dollar increases or decreases, that can impact the value of our foreign investments when they're repatriated to be used to pay assets. And so the system has engaged in a program to kind of hedge against fluctuations in the value of the dollar. And as of current year, the program has added value of about 385.9 million since inception. That's up from 274.7 million since last year. In theory, it should, over infinite time, zero out, but the system does actually take steps to kind of manage a little asymmetrically, so that when we're in those situations where it's providing value, they can utilize drawing value out while dialing it down a little bit when we think it's going to be a drag on investments. And that is everything I have for you. If there's any questions, if not, I know the agency has prepared responses.
Thank you, Philip. I'm not seeing any raised hands. Okay, going once, twice, and onto the system. Thank you.
Andy, I see you about to speak and you're muted, but as you speak, could you talk a little bit about, it's great to hear about the Terra Maria program outperforming everybody else. And I'd appreciate hearing what we're doing to bring investment managers who do active management through the Terra Maria program into the main investment program as active managers, not just siloed in the Terra Maria program. Thanks.
Certainly. Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me okay. I want to first thank Philip for the excellent analysis as usual, and also Bob Bird for most of the presentation that you have in written response. And if it pleases the chairs, I'll take a few minutes to summarize the written responses that you have. Bob went into a lot of detail there. I'm not going to go through all the detail, and I'll talk on big picture things, but if there are weeds to pull, I'll let you pull them and we'll get into them on your at your request. So I'll just to echo Philip's comments on performance. It's a little bit weird to say that I'm pleased to report on the performance because we're down 3%, which is not something to be pleased about. But for some of the reasons that Philip mentioned, 3% was better than many of our peers, and it was better than the benchmark. So we added a bit, we saved a bit of money relative to what we might have done if we just earned what the benchmark did. But what's particularly pleasing for me is that 2021 was a really strong year where we were up 26% and our benchmark was 24%. So we added a lot of value. We participated in the market that was very strong. And we're able to capture those extra gains then. And then the next year, completely different market. The portfolio stood up, and the structure that we put in place was able to protect us on the downside. So outperforming on the upside and when markets are down is hard to do, and I'm just pleased that we were able to do that. So if you look at maybe looking over the last 3 years, really since this legislation, Philip talked about went into place, the system has outperformed the benchmark on average about 1% each year. And if you think about that in terms of dollars, that's added about $2 billion of additional value to the system above just having sort of passive exposure to these asset classes. So I'm very pleased about that. And I think it's not just the managers doing things. It is a part of a multi-year plan to improve the performance of the system, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So focusing on 2022, as Philip mentioned, we benefited from our private assets, and there's sometimes people are concerned about, well, how can the private assets be that good if the market is so soft? And over time, we expect, and our experience has supported, that the private assets in the market will outperform public markets over time, and that's what we've done. But we recognize that because the value is appraisal based. They put an estimate of what the value is. It's not set by the market each quarter. They move more slowly. And so in 2022, our real estate assets returned 30%, as Philip mentioned, and private equity of 24%. And so part of the fact that they were so strong was that they're still catching up to the really strong performance that the public markets had in 2021. And June 30th, the economy was still strong. All of these businesses were rocking along. Real estate valuations, they were all rented up. So there wasn't really any strain there. We'll probably see some softening going forward. But if, as we've seen in this past quarter, so far this quarter, equity markets are pretty strong. And as if they continue that, then the private markets will sort of just bridge the volatility in private and public markets. Private markets will kind of bridge it, and we'll have the volatility, but we'll see that they do reflect those longer term changes in valuations that we see in the public markets. So part of that is by design. That helps us in periods like to retain value, so we don't have a big drop down in valuation for purposes of setting contribution rates. The underperformance came in the public markets, and that we don't think that's systematic. We don't think that's a long-term problem. We have benefited over the years on the equity side from having exposure to very high growth companies like Tesla and Moderna and things like that in the portfolio. Those assets were particularly hard hit when the market rolled over, when interest rates went up, and during the Russian invasion, and that sort of undermined our equity performance. The bond portfolio, we had a couple of managers that didn't believe that the Fed was going to tighten as much, so they were on the wrong side of duration. They are long-term managers that we've had, and long-term performance is strong. So we don't anticipate that'll be a persistent problem. So we expect that they'll recoup most of those losses in months and years to come. Philip mentioned the relative performance in TUX. So the mix of assets kind of drives the performance, and even if we just earn what's the market, then we expect to have good performance relative to our peers over time. But the TUX really looks at 30 large plans on a gross of fee basis, And on that basis, we are like 37th percentile, meaning we outperformed 63% of our peers for 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years, and 41st percentile for 5 years. Importantly, we were able to do that while staying in the top quartile in terms of the risk, the safety of the portfolio. It's very low risk. And so for those of you who've been on the Joint Committee for a long period of time, this is a big improvement from where we were many years ago. I saw Senator Casemeyer on a call the other day, and I think he would be very pleased to see these numbers being a bit better. The other way we look at it is a group called Investor Force, which looks at a larger pool of plans, and maybe about twice as many plans as the Tux universe. There's some smaller plans in there, but they report on a net of fee basis, which is what's available for paying benefits. And so we think that's a good measure as well, and look better in that one than even better at 14th percentile for 1 year and 8th for 3 years. So strong relative performance, which we're pleased to see. And just a passing note on 60/40, we talked a lot in this venue in the past about whether or not it would be simpler to just have a 60/40 passive portfolio, and it'd be simple, cheap, and just go with that. And this is the kind of year when, as Philip mentioned, it demonstrates the value of having this diversified portfolio, not only across countries, but across types of investment vehicles, because that portfolio would have been down between 10 and 13%. And the way that impacts contribution rates is, I think I'm getting this right, and the actuaries were on, maybe they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that for the state's contribution, if we had been in a 60/40 plan, it'd be an extra $110 million this year for contributions, even though we smoothed it over 5 years. So another way to think about that is if the next 4 years we earn 6.8%, the contribution rate would go up, I think 100, there's Brad's going to correct me if I'm wrong. It will go up 110 million a year relative to where it otherwise would be. There's other gains and losses that might flow through there, but it has protected the contribution rate from being more volatile in this period. As I mentioned, this is all kind of a larger plan we've been working on, and in partnership with you and the board and my team. And the vision really is that as we pay down this unfunded liability, this plan is going to grow to be $100 billion in assets. And we recognized in 2015 that it would be difficult with the business model that we had for this investment organization to meet the needs of that larger plan. And so we've been working with the board on an asset allocation. Philip mentioned that we look at that every year. We've been trying to improve that process. We've been trying to improve the implementation, and largely that's been investing in the people, which you guys have helped us do. And then the third is keeping more of the asset returns that the system's assets generate through lower costs. And so we've been effective in all three of those things, and you can see progress. The asset allocation, compared to what we had in 2014, the decisions the boards have made since then has added almost 1% to the returns per year, which is about 85 basis points per year to returns by making better asset allocation choices. You can see the return improvements by having a deeper and more resilient team through the investments we've made in the people there. And then we've been able to bend the curve a bit on fees as well. The way we like to look at it is that the incentive fees that we pay are variable, and they move around a lot. One of the questions is, what do we think the private equity carry will be this year? And just as an example, in 2020 calendar year, the private equity carry was about $200 million. That was the COVID year when we had wasn't not a lot of transactions going on, very disrupted. This past year, when we had that really big equity rally and firms were able to make a lot of sales and realize investments, we had $370 million. And so that bounces around a lot, and that happens with the incentive fees as well. And for this year, we think it's going to be somewhere in between, with the softness in public equity markets and the disruption around higher interest rates, we think it'll be with fewer realizations. We'll see when we get the final number. So if I had a guess, I'd say around 300 million, better than the COVID year, but not as strong as last year. But we'll have to see. I mean, I don't have, that's just a pure estimate from experience without numbers to back it up. And so if we just look at the core fees, which is just the fees that we pay to managers, including private and public managers, we were paying about 64 basis points in 2016. And for this past year, that dropped to 52 basis points. Philip mentioned 83. The difference there is that we paid incentive fees, and we think those are important because that means we're generating excess returns. They're good. That's a positive signal. But the base fees have dropped from 64 to 52, and that's come from 4 different effects. One is that every time we engage with a manager, we push as hard as we can to lower fees, and we've had some success there. Philip mentioned bringing some of the assets in-house. That's been a modest impact on fees so far because we've been largely replacing passive managers. The other part Philip also mentioned, which is co-investment, that's more meaningful. We have not that many dollars there, but it saves a lot of fees for us. I think maybe about 75 million in fees so far in savings on the co-investments. And then the last piece is a little bit quirky, that as the market values of private assets go up, our basis point fee goes down because we pay fees in the private and limited partnerships, private equity and most real estate, things like that, on how much we committed, not the value of the assets. So that as the value of the assets go up, the basis point fee on that goes down. So all of those things have combined to help us lower our costs, and we think that's helping us raise our net return for the beneficiaries. We've been watching the Federal Reserve announcement today, and just to give you an update on where we are so far this year, and there might be a question there. Through November, even though the market's been pretty volatile, we think the system's about flat. Markets have been up so far this month, so that's kind of positive for the fiscal year to date. Between now and June 30th, it's going to depend on what the Federal Reserve does. We had inflation a little bit better yesterday than the market expected, and that the Fed could use that to stop tightening as much and kind of have a smooth landing and have inflation come down. The market's kind of pricing that solution in, and they think the Fed's going to be able to do that. So that's been supporting stock prices. To the extent they're surprised and we have stronger inflation and the Fed has to do more, that would make it harder for us to have a positive outcome by the end of the year. But wherever the Fed is, it's closer to stopping than it was in any time in the last year. So that turn is coming. So I'll stop there on terms of performance. The other aspects I wanted to mention, one.
Hey.
Yep. Got a question?
Yeah.
Oh, Delegate Resnick, I think you're not on mute. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to talk about the climate bill. I wanted to talk about the staffing bill, and to get to Delegate Lehrman's question on Terra Maria. So I'll start with the staffing bill. So I wanted to thank you all for your work last year to help us with this one problem. Just to put on your radar, the original legislation created the process of a review of this by setting up the Objective Criteria Committee, which Delegate Lehrman staunchly served on 4 years ago or so, and retain the compensation consultant again. And so that's going to happen in this next year. There's a couple of things we think they may focus on. One, that 10% cap, maybe that's not as required as it was a few years ago when we were just starting out. We can look at that. There is some implications there. You can look at this year where state employees have had, because of inflation, there's been 10 or 11% of increases for that group, and then potentially some merit increases if you had a promotion or something. And so that this type of environment is going to suck up all of that 10% for the investment staff in all likelihood this year, with leaving little for promotions and merit. So there may be some discussion there. And the other piece is that the enabling legislation created two types of individuals in the investment division, one where the board has a lot of authority and the other group where there's less authority. And it's kind of creating some tension within the group, and especially the group where the board has less authority. They feel like a second-class citizen, and it's kind of creating some issues for us. We'll see when we go through all that if there's something to address there. But just wanted to put that on your radar. Overall, it's been very effective and a great help for us. So, as I said, every time I come, I'm going to thank you for it. So thank you for working with us on that. The second piece is the climate bill. And as Philip mentioned, we've already been working on this. We did hire a woman named Dominique Cherry. She joined us from the City of Philadelphia Pension Board, and she's hit the ground running. She worked in a couple of weeks to put together a second draft of investment policy manual changes to implement all of this. We're going to have another go at it in February. There's a lot of discussion on the board. It's creating some great discussion on that topic, and we'll have more work there with the board on how to implement all that stuff. But the staff has got three different pieces that we're working on. One is we're continuing to evaluate the risks. We've got some activities, and we'll report all of this in the risk report that comes out in January. A lot of different things. One thing I'd highlight is that the University of Maryland is trying to create a center on climate finance, and I've been working with that group, Russ Wormer down there, and some others, and I think they're doing some great work. That's something I'm really looking forward to working with those folks there. We're working on considering the opportunities for investment, and we can talk more about that if there are questions. And then Dominique, particular, is working on how we can enhance our proxy and engagement process and figure out how do we measure its effectiveness. So nothing really concrete to say, we have this product that is, the shining example of what we're doing, but it's all aspects of the investment process are engaged in thinking about how to implement that bill. And the last question was on Terra Maria. And I guess I'll talk broadly about that. So we have this program that focuses on managers and the ownership structure of managers in the Terra Maria program. That's a part of what we do, that we focus on diversity. And to your specific question, every time we have a potential to add a new group, a new hire, we look at that group to see if there's somebody we can elevate. We've done that a few times in the past, and we were looking at, in the public equity side, we were looking at that just recently. It happens sort of naturally. We kind of report on the public asset side, but we have some emerging managers also in the private side. And that sort of happens naturally. A lot of times they're coming back with fund after fund after fund. And as long as we keep investing in them, they become larger. But we don't really have a graduation program per se, because we don't have a large enough public market space to push people out. But we do look at the whole group as a resource for us when we're evaluating potential changes to the portfolio. The other thing I just mentioned is that we've been doing the Terra Maria program for, I think 2008 is when that started. We had an emerging manager program starting in 2007. So 15-year history here. And what we've noticed is that it's not really making a big difference in terms of the industry that much. We don't see that the number of diverse people owning firms is particularly growing, and we really haven't noticed that much change in the makeup of the people who are working at all of our firms. So we've been working a bit more on that. We hired a group called Lenox Park, and I'm going to go over my time because this is sort of a question. I'm putting this in my question period, so and I'm trying to keep under 20 minutes here. But that group went out. What it's doing is it's looking at not just the ownership structure, it's looking at the management of the companies that we invest in, and it's looking at the makeup of the workforce underneath that, and trying to create some benchmark scoring that we can use to look at our managers when we're discussing these topics with them, and to use with our to compare us to peers. And so we just had the first round of this, and as you can imagine, we had to pay for this. So the people who are paying for this are people who care about this topic, and the system looks pretty good on their scoring. We're in the 73rd percentile, sort of on their, I'm sorry, on the 67th percentile on their general scores, which means that we're doing, it's the opposite of the Tux one. So 67th percentile is good.
Sorry, it's hard to know what Lennox Park Investments or Park Solutions is. So could you perhaps send some follow-up information on that and the work that you're doing? That would be helpful.
Yeah. So I guess my point is that we're taking it behind, past just the management, the ownership of the company, and trying to look at the whole industry and try to drive change throughout that, because we think that's the other work was not really making much of a difference in the industry. And we think this is going to help the firms make better investment decisions and lead to better outcomes. And so that's kind of where we've been taking it. I think I wanted to share that with you because it's a big part of our more recent initiatives in this area. We'll send the report that will be shared with the board, that's okay. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andy. I don't see any hands raised. And thank you for and the staff, particularly on the implementation of our ESG bill from last year. I appreciate there was some discussion at the last board meeting, and Philip and I were talking about this bill just the other day. And Philip, I'm going to quote you when you discuss it as Maryland's third way, as we're seeing trends in both directions across the country. I think we really did strike a balance, and key word or concept here being just for the board to take under consideration certain challenges that are pressuring our system. And just want to thank the staff for implementing that with fidelity.
Yep. Hear, hear.
Okay.
You've got a quiet group today.
I mesmerized them. I think that's the
answer. No. Thank you for that. Thanks for the overview. And yes, it'd be great to see some sort of follow-up information. And Marty, this might be just a follow-up piece for you. Some of the comptrollers around who are fiduciaries of their pension fund, Brad Landers in New York City and others, have started putting out reports on the sort of demographics and diversity and types of holdings. And so I'm sure that we do some of that. And it would be great to see if you could share some of the reporting that we do. I know you've shared in the past, but perhaps a follow-up and refresher would be helpful for everybody to just see the kind of reporting that we do as well.
Of course, Andy really has done some fantastic work on this. I think we don't talk about it enough, so we're happy to get that out there, and we need to.
Great.
Because especially this Lennox Park, it's really, that's something special. That's something really meaningful. So we need to explain that and make sure everyone understands what we're doing and why we're doing.
Great, thank you. Senator Roosevelt?
Yeah, thank you. I was interested in hearing about the Lennox Park stuff. I am interested in reading about how it actually works, because it's the first time I've heard of that. But that jogged in my mind, and this will not shock any of my colleagues on here, but it made me think about apprenticeships and career pathways. And I know Senator Griffith, Senator Elfrith are rolling over, but seriously, we do have a serious workforce mismatch in the United States that affects all kinds of companies. And we're trying to deal with it in Maryland. I've just put on your agenda to think about. Maybe you can get the answer now. If you don't, if you can find out, is there any analysis done of companies around those issues that we could look at as we look at other ways of evaluating companies? Because companies that can't staff themselves don't do very well over the long run.
So companies that have big outreach programs to train and bring people in. I haven't seen studies, but I'm happy to do some work and find.
That'd be great. That'd be great. I mean, it's a little bigger than outreach. It's some companies are very good and strategic at recruiting, training, upskilling their workforce to meet their needs. And some companies aren't. They just steal everybody else's workers. And that hurts the economy as a whole. I mean, that's why it's a common good, not just an individual good for a company.
No, I totally agree with you, Senator. And one of the things that we were noticing, especially around this DEI question, is that since George Floyd, this has become a major focus of every entity, especially in the investment world. I'm pretty sure across the country. And what I see people doing is they've all said, okay, we're going to go talk to HBCUs, and we're going to try to they're all fighting over a small number of
absolutely
students, right?
Exactly right.
And what we need to do is work together to figure out, well, how do we get to the middle schoolers and develop that? And we see some programs like that, but they're not coordinated. And I would love to have something in the state of Maryland where we can work together as
well,
financial
we actually do
services.
that. It's called the blueprint law that we passed. Actually has a whole plan on that.
Okay.
That we'll share with you. You share what stuff with us. We'll share stuff. We have a plan.
If I can find some data, I'll share it with you. I don't have anything at hand.
Yeah, but I'm asking more in terms of what you do, investing in nationwide and worldwide companies. I think it'd be helpful for us to understand how they are going about this. Maryland, we got a plan for how we want to do it in Maryland, which we hope will work out. But anyway, just want to put it on the agenda. Thank you, Madam Chairs, for your patience in letting me talk about apprenticeships.
It wouldn't be a meeting with B&T members if you didn't talk about apprenticeships. So, okay. Any other questions, comments, things we'd like to work on before session? Okay, Chair Learman, if I could just take a moment and thank one member of our joint committee in particular who served many years on joint committee on pensions, and that's Senator Addie Eckert. And this is her last meeting of the joint committee of pensions. I can't thank her enough for her service, not just to this joint committee and not just to budget and tax, but the entire state of Maryland. We are so grateful, Addie, for all of your contributions. Your unique perspective and experience that you brought to every single discussion has just been an incredible asset that we will miss dearly. So I just want to thank you. And if you'd like to say anything to the group, more than welcome.
I would, and thank you very much, Madam Chair and Madam Co-Chair. I appreciated the opportunity, and I wanted to stay on in here because, you know, we've instituted a lot of these changes over the years, and it's always good to see the positive outcome. It's always exciting to see the staff who present excited about the changes that have made. But thank you for your leadership. Thank Delegate Learman in her new role. Congratulations. And for everybody who works so diligently. I'm very biased. I am going back into working in the belly of state government because I believe our state employees are some of the best in the country and have the best ideas. So we do need to work on that, including traineeship. And Senator Rosa Pep, I am working on growing the workforce. So we will try to put all of that in practice. But thank you so much. I will miss you all, but I will be busy with another endeavor. So God bless and thank you all. It's been a privilege and an honor to serve.
Been ours.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Eckert.
Thank you, Senator.
We're glad you won't be a stranger.
Yes.
No, I won't be a stranger. I have everybody's phone number, remember?
It is true.
Thank you all.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you. A huge thank you to Philip and June for all of your preparation, your patience with us, and all of the really incredible work that you've done. It's been an honor. When I first ran for office and I was knocking on doors on hot August afternoons, I admit that I was not thinking, yes, pensions, I'm totally going to go be a state delegate and work on pensions. But now I love it and I understand it. And it's been such an incredible 8 years on the pension committee. So thank you so much for all of your great work. And Marty and Andy, thank you. And to all the members, I appreciate your patience and your work. And it's been an honor to serve with you. And I look forward to seeing you on the other side of the desk soon.
Well, you beat me. Delegate Lehrman. We're so excited for your new role. You will certainly not be a stranger to the General Assembly or this joint committee. And we're just so glad to have you continue to be a partner. And thank you for your 8 years of service to the joint committee.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great to serve with you, Senator Elfreth. It's really been a lot of fun and incredibly interesting. And I look forward to continuing to do it in a new way. Thanks, everyone, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, yes.
Okay. With that, I think we're good until seeing everybody's pretty faces on January 11th. So, okay, everybody have a lovely holiday season.
Thanks.
Take care.
Happy
Bye.
holidays, Anne.
Happy holidays.